In 1954, a fishing boat with nothing more than a basic depth sounder picked up something 480 feet down in a Scottish lake that should not have been there. Not a fish. Not the bottom. Something solid, something large, tracking beneath the hull for half a mile before it vanished back into the dark. No one on that boat was looking for a monster. They were just trying to get home. And that single, boring, unglamorous instrument reading is still sitting there, unexplained, 70 years later. This is the story of Loch Ness, not the toy in the bathtub everyone thinks they know, but the evidence nobody bothered to throw away. Most people's entire understanding of Loch Ness begins and ends with one photograph. A long neck curling out of grey water, a small head turned to the side, framed like something caught mid-breath before diving back under. That image became the most reproduced picture of an unidentified animal in modern history. It sold postcards, it launched a tourism industry, and in 1994 it was exposed as a hoax. A toy submarine fitted with a sculpted head, floated on the loch by a man with a grudge against a newspaper. When that confession came out, the public reaction was swift. If the most famous evidence was fake, the whole legend must be fake. Case closed. Except that conclusion skipped over almost everything that actually mattered. Because long before that photograph was even taken, and long after it was debunked, something else kept showing up in the data, not on film, not in a witness's memory, but on instruments that have no opinion about legends and no motive to lie. Let's start with the lake itself, because Loch Ness is not an ordinary body of water, and that fact alone should reshape how you think about this whole mystery. It runs roughly 23 miles through the Great Glen, a fault line gouged out by retreating glacier, and in places it plunges to depths of over 750 feet. It holds more fresh water than every lake in England and Wales combined. The water itself is stained almost black by peat washing down from the surrounding hills, which means visibility collapses to almost nothing within a few feet of the surface. A diver descending into Loch Ness doesn't fade gradually into darkness the way you would an open ocean. There's a point where daylight simply stops, replaced by a wall of total black that no amount of time lets your eyes adjust to. You could pass within touching distance of something the size of a small whale and never know it was there. Add to that a deep water temperature that sits at a near constant 5 or 6 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to sap strength from a diver's limbs in minutes, and you start to understand why this lake has resisted every attempt to simply go down and look. We have sharper maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the floor of this one Scottish lake. That's not a metaphor. That's a documented gap in our knowledge of our own planet. And here's the detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story: Loch Ness isn't sealed off from the rest of the world. The River Ness drains out its northern end toward the sea, and since the Caledonian Canal was completed in 1822, the loch has been directly linked to the North Sea through a working chain of lochs. Seals have been recorded well up into the freshwater system. Atlantic salmon migrate through it on their way to spawn. Whatever lives in that loch is not necessarily trapped in a closed tank of known species. It has, at least in theory, a route in from the ocean and a route back out. Now to the sighting that started it all. On the 2nd of May, 1933, John and Alder Mackay were driving along a newly widened road on the loch's northern shore when Alder spotted something disturbing the surface roughly 100 yards out. Not a wave, not a boat wake, a large dark mass rolling and churning the water before sinking and leaving the loch smooth again, as if nothing had happened. The Mackays ran a hotel on the water. They knew what the loch normally looked like. A local newspaper correspondent wrote up their account, and somewhere in that process, an editor reached for a word that would follow the loch for the next 90 years: monster. It was the first time Loch Ness and monster ever appeared together in print, and once they did, they never really came apart. What happened over the following year is what makes this more than a single strange morning. Reports kept coming: a motorcyclist who nearly collided with something crossing the road at night, tourists pulling over to watch, longtime locals finally admitting they'd seen something themselves, but had stayed quiet out of embarrassment. And the striking part is how consistent the descriptions were. Strangers who had never met each other, standing on different stretches of a 23-mile shoreline in different months and different light, kept describing the same handful of features: a long neck raised above the water, sometimes topped with a small head, one or more dark humps breaking the surface in a line, a wake far too large for any known animal in that lake. By 1934, this local curiosity had become an international story, with newspapers sending reporters north and expeditions setting up cameras along the shore. Then came the photograph. And when it was finally exposed as a hoax 60 years later, the public treated it as the end of the story. But the researchers who had actually spent decades studying this lake had never trusted that photograph in the first place. The ripples around the object were wrong for something that size. The proportions didn't match any known swimming animal. They'd quietly filed it under unreliable long before the truth came out. For them, the hoax confirmed a suspicion, it didn't create a crisis. The real case for something unexplained in Loch Ness never rested on that image. It rested on something far less photogenic and far harder to fake: acoustic data. Go back to that 1954 sonar contact for a moment, because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. A working fishing vessel, using a simple echo sounder meant only to check depth and locate fish, picked up a single dense, solid object at around 480 feet, well below where any fish school should be sitting. It wasn't the scattered, fuzzy return you get from a shoal of fish. It was one hard, continuous contact, and it held its depth while tracking beneath the boat for close to half a mile before fading. These were working fishermen, not tourists chasing a legend, and they couldn't fit what they'd seen into any category they knew. Not a fish school. Not the bottom, which doesn't move. Not drifting debris, which doesn't hold a steady depth for half a mile. This contact predates the famous hoax photograph by exactly zero motive. It happened decades before that fraud was even exposed, and it never depended on it. When the photograph collapsed in 1994, this piece of evidence didn't collapse with it, because it had never been connected to it in the first place. That 1954 reading turned out to be the first thread in a much longer pattern. In 1968, a university research team, led by Professor D. Gordon Tucker, brought new sonar equipment to Loch Ness, not to hunt a monster, but because the loch's depth and shape made it an ideal natural testing tank for acoustic instruments. Tucker had no interest in cryptids and no reason to want an exotic result. His professional reputation depended on caution, not spectacle. Yet his equipment recorded multiple large objects moving, rising, and diving through the water column in ways that couldn't be explained by currents or thermal layers. Analyzing the data the way he would analyze any signal, Tucker concluded the targets were animate, moving under their own power, at a scale and behavior he couldn't attribute to any known cause. That's a very different kind of evidence than an eyewitness account. It's a skeptic, professionally invested in finding a boring explanation, unable to find one. Through the 1970s, more attempts followed. A patent attorney and physicist paired sonar equipment with underwater cameras rigged to fire automatically when something large entered the beam. Some of the resulting images, showing what looked like a large flipper-shaped appendage, were controversial enough to be picked apart for years. Some researchers saw a genuine anomaly, others saw silt and debris distorted by the murky water, and a wide-angle lens. That debate was never fully settled, but the images were still considered credible enough to be published in a respected scientific journal, and that publication was never retracted. By 1987, researchers organized the largest coordinated sonar search the loch had ever seen, around 24 boats moving in a coordinated line, sweeping the water with overlapping sonar beams in what was nicknamed Operation Deep Scan. 3 large, unexplained contacts were recorded, at depths well below where the loch's known fish species typically live. The head of the company that supplied the sonar equipment described the size of the returns as larger than a shark, but smaller than a whale, a strange, hedged description from someone with no obvious incentive to invent a monster. Selling sonar equipment doesn't require sensational headlines. More recently, in 2019, a research team, led by geneticist Neil Gemmell, ran an environmental DNA survey, sampling the loch's water to catalogue every species leaving genetic traces behind. They found no evidence of a plesiosaur or any large, unknown reptile. What they did find was an unusually high concentration of eel DNA. That led to a much more grounded hypothesis, that unusually large eels, potentially far bigger than the documented record of around 5 feet, could account for at least some sightings. An eel that never migrated out to spawn, growing for decades in that cold, low-light environment, could plausibly produce the humps and undulating movement people have described. It's a compelling partial answer. But it doesn't fully explain everything on record. It doesn't explain a solid, singular contact sitting at 600 feet, far below where eels are typically found, and it doesn't match some of the size estimates that researchers have attached to certain sonar contacts over the decades. So where does that leave the mystery? Not with a confirmed sea monster, and not with a fully closed case either. It leaves us with a lake that has produced multiple independent, professionally gathered pieces of acoustic data, from working fishermen with no stake in the legend, from a cautious university engineer, from a peer-reviewed journal, from a coordinated multi-boat sonar sweep, none of which depended on that infamous hoax photograph, and none of which were ever debunked alongside it. It leaves us with a genuine, still unresolved gap between what sonar has recorded in that loch and what science can currently explain. None of this proves a prehistoric survivor is living in a Scottish lake. Long-necked marine reptiles from millions of years ago would have needed to surface regularly to breathe, and a breeding population large enough to persist for generations would be almost impossible to hide completely from modern instruments and camera equipment. That's a serious problem for the classic lost dinosaur theory, and it's worth being honest about that up front. What the evidence more plausibly points to is something less dramatic, but still genuinely unresolved: an unusually large, undocumented population of eels or other fish moving at depths and in numbers we haven't fully mapped, in a lake so dark, cold, and vast that direct visual confirmation remains close to impossible even today. Whether that fully accounts for every sonar anomaly on record, including contacts at depths eels rarely reach, is still an open question, and honest researchers continue to say so. What's genuinely interesting here isn't a settled answer. It's how much of this evidence gets erased from the public conversation the moment one famous fake photograph gets exposed. The debunking of a toy submarine somehow became, in the public imagination, the debunking of an entire 90-year data set that photograph was never actually connected to. That's the real story worth telling, not a monster, but how easily an entire body of legitimate, independently gathered evidence can be dismissed the moment the flashiest piece of it turns out to be fraudulent. So here's the question worth sitting with. Of everything laid out here, the solid 1954 sonar contact at 480 feet, Professor Tucker's reluctant conclusion that his instruments were tracking something animate, the unexplained eel DNA abundance, or the deep contacts recorded during the 1987 sonar sweep, which single piece of evidence is hardest for you to explain away? Drop your answer in the comments, and tell me exactly why that one detail sticks with you.